And now it's time for the news review section where we delve deeper into one of the day's top stories. So stay with us. The Hamas resistance movement says there will be no new negotiations with Israel unless the regime stops its aggression on the Gaza Strip and adheres to International Court of Justice order. A senior Hamas official said Israel is trying to evade the ICJ obligations by offering new ceasefire proposals that would buy the regime more time for its aggression. Osama Hamdan said Hamas has already agreed to a ceasefire proposal, which was later rejected by Israel. He said Israel must stop its aggression, or Gaza aggression, and its siege and achieve a fair captives exchange deal. The regime is reportedly seeking new rounds of ceasefire and captive exchange talks in coming days. The ICJ has called on Israel to immediately halt its military offensive in Rafah and open its crossing for the delivery of humanitarian aid. And to talk more on this, we are joined by Mr. Yves Engler, author and political activist from Montreal, and also Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist from Bristol. Welcome to the program, I think we have Mr. Gosling right now. Mr. Gosling, beginning with you, obviously. Around a couple of weeks ago, we thought we could finally see an end to the nearly 7 months long onslaught on Gaza, in which Israel killed at least, at that time, 35,000 Palestinians. Now it's nearing 40,000 now. However, Israel stalled the talks and continued to emphasize on its desire to attack the refugee-packed southern city of Rafah despite an international outcry. But now, with the recent ICJ ruling on Friday, the regime wants to resume the talks. Your thoughts on that, Mr. Gosling?
Well, they were always talking about wanting to make peace through talking. But I'm afraid the Netanyahu Greater Israel faction have never wanted peace. They don't want peace now. And the evidence for that is the friend of Netanyahu's, who was responsible for the assassination in November 1995 of the fifth Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin. He was one of the people in the whole of Israeli history that's come closest to having a peace deal with the Palestinians, and he was assassinated for his trouble. I honestly believe that it's a little bit like we had here in the Northern Ireland conflict back in the 1980s and 70s, where there were all sorts of attempts to have negotiations. But actually, we now know at the bottom of it, there was a very belligerent loyalist terrorist group in Northern Ireland, as well as the British Army, who didn't want peace. They wanted to carry on using Northern Ireland as a training ground and as a way to really dominate for the largely Protestant, but mainly Unionist population, to dominate the weaker nationalist Catholic population. And so I think you've got a similar thing that's been going on in a way. Northern Ireland was like the training ground for what's been happening. And I don't think they actually honestly want peace. You've got a lot of use of religious rhetoric, but this is actually, I believe, Gnosticism, which is where God's role is hijacked by evil men for their own political and financial purposes. So that's the way I see it, that they actually do want to continue this as long as they possibly can, particularly now with these international court judgments. I'd like to add, if I may, about the effect that this week's International Criminal Court request for arrest warrants for the senior Israeli government officials, Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, I think it is, maybe it was one of the other ones. But anyway, these two senior defence minister and prime minister of Israel, this had a massive effect here in Britain on Monday. Contacts I speak to at Westminster tell me it was like a shockwave through the British Parliament. Because if you think these are British lawmakers, they know the law very well. And they know that by the British government and the British military cooperating with the genocide that's been going on in the Gaza Strip, that anyone it could possibly be simply added on to these arrest warrants because they are complicit with genocide. In fact, we had a Conservative MP, Crispin Blunt, right at the very start, just after October the 7th, saying, hang on, guys, if you support what's going on in Gaza, or the Israeli retaliation, you could yourself be arrested for complicity with war crimes. So I believe this is one of the reasons why we've had a call for a general election here in Britain, because the government don't have the stomach to take this on. They don't want to keep supporting the Israelis, and yet there's political pressure, diplomatic pressure, and financial pressure for them to do so. So they're now thinking, well, if the Conservatives don't want to, maybe the Labour Party and their Labour Friends of Israel, they're a new team to take over the job of supporting the Israeli genocide here in London.
Mr. Gosling, but we know it's a significant move, the arrest warrants, but how likely is it for them to be arrested?
Well, look, if they genuinely roll back from these attacks on civilian personnel, then it may not happen. But the fact of the matter is, as we've seen over the years with many particularly with the illegal invasion of Iraq, there are all sorts of repercussions. For example, in Malaysia and in some other countries, people like Bush and Blair, and actually Zippy Livni as well, I believe, was found guilty in absentia of war crimes. And so there are certain countries, particularly Malaysia, as far as I know, definitely Malaysia, where they cannot go. And if they land at the airport, as soon as they get off the plane, they'll be arrested. Now, world leaders don't like this sort of thing hanging over them. They had a similar thing, by the way, after the Chile coup in the 1970s. Henry Kissinger couldn't visit Sweden. And so they don't like this. They don't want to be arrested as they step off the plane. It's a bit embarrassing. Although those arrest warrants may not be implemented immediately, the fact that the legal process is inching forwards all the time, of course, it's a terrible threat. And of course, Netanyahu is no stranger to this. There's been a legal process, and the handcuffs have been pursuing him in the Israeli courts for the last several years for fraud. And he's been proven to have committed fraud. He's just managed so far to dance his way out of jail. Now, it might not be quite so easy to avoid these arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court and also the International Court of Justice. So the two main global courts are both gunning right now, particularly this week, for the Israelis, saying also the ICJ saying ordering them to stop any attack planned on Rafah. And so these legal things, I think, are taken seriously by lawyers. They get legal advice, many of these government ministers, which they don't share with journalists or the public. And many of those lawyers will be saying it's time to back off. And that's, I think, a very good message, certainly in Israel, but also to those countries like the United States and Britain that have been supporting Netanyahu.
That's right, Mr. Gosling, but there's a problem here. From what we've seen so far, with all the various international entities that have been set up, we are still approaching the 8th month of this genocide in Gaza, and 40,000 casualties, mostly women and children, nearly 70% of them. So doesn't this show that the current international mechanisms have totally failed, and there must be another, an alternative, let's say?
Well, look, everyone knows the legal processes don't happen just like that. They're quite slow. The really most important international process to have done something about this should have been through the United Nations Security Council. And although many people like to support the Chinese, I would like to say I don't think that they have acted robustly enough. I think we should have had calls from the Chinese. China as a major superpower and a permanent member of the UN Security Council, I think should have been pushing and saying, hey, let's have an international force in there of UN soldiers to separate the Israelis and the Palestinians. And actually what it would potentially have ended up doing would be pushing the Israelis back outside the Gaza borders, and also, of course, helping bring aid in. But we've had silence, really, from China at the UN Security Council on these sorts of measures. I mean, many people will say, oh, well, the Americans would just have vetoed such a proposal. But it's important those proposals are made, even if the US has to then embarrass itself by vetoing international action for peace. So, yeah, there are other ways of doing it, not just through the courts, and it's good that the courts have done this. But really, the UN Security Council and the Chinese and maybe potentially the Russians. But obviously the Russians are already virtually in a war with the United States in the Ukraine, and so that is not such a diplomatically good move. But the Chinese, I think, haven't done enough at the UN to assert the powers that they do have in order to try and create a buffer zone and get UN forces in to separate the Palestinians, but basically to protect the Palestinians and to feed and clothe and to get water to the Palestinians, immediately.
Like you said, Mr. Gosling, there was more expected and is expected from China. There you have it, Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist from Bristol. Thank you for your time, sir. And with that, we come to the end of this news review section. Thank you for listening.